Hey everyone, welcome to True Crime California. I'm your host, Cindy, and I'm glad you're here. Welcome, everybody. This is a really exciting day. This is the first episode of True Crime California. I'm your host, Cindy. And as some of you may know, I am formerly a podcast host from the podcast Twisted Listers. I used to host that with my friend and co podcaster, Diva. We did it for about 3.5 years. It was super fun. It was pretty successful. We had a lot of listeners, but unfortunately, life kind of got in the way, and we just found it more and more difficult to find time to record together. So eventually we had to kind of put it on the back burner, and I decided to strike out on my own with my own podcast. If anybody's wondering, I definitely have Diva's blessing. She even told me that she would be one of my listeners. So I know I'm going to get at least one download a week, which is great. Hopefully more. But yeah, I decided to do a topic that I am really familiar with and just love, and that is true crime in the state of California. Now, many of you who have listened to Twisted Listers know that I'm from California. I spent a little time in Oregon, but basically, most of my life I've been born and raised in California. I live in Southern California currently. And I always get really excited when I'm doing cases from California. So it feels right to do a whole podcast dedicated to that. And, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, I'm probably not going to run out of material for a very, very long time. Now, I'm going to do cases that are both super well known and also more obscure. I want to kind of run the gamut there and keep things interesting and tell the stories of victims and survivors that maybe you haven't heard of before. But I'm also definitely going to give my take on more popular and well known stories as well, because I think people like to hear, various retellings and different versions of things that we all know. And are familiar with. So, without further ado, I'm going to jump in and do just that. I'm going to tell the story of a celebrity murder that took place in the 80s, actually. So, it's not a brand new case by any means, but it's one that was really well known and kind of shaped Hollywood and, kind of the way that we look at certain parts of Hollywood, kind of changed our view. And it was a really well known case back then. It's still pretty well known now. There's going to be some names that we all recognize in this story. And I'm really excited. So let's get into it. For my first True Crime California case, I am going to cover the murder of Dorothy Stratten. Now, I don't know if people are familiar with her, but she was a huge star in the late 70s and early 80s. So I'm just going to get into it. Dorothy Stratten was actually born Dorothy Hoog Stratten, February 28th, 1960, in Vancouver, British Columbia. So she's Canadian. She was born to Simon and Nellie Hoog Stratten. They were immigrants from the Netherlands, and Dorothy was a first generation Canadian. So her parents immigrated to Canada and then had Dorothy once they were there. She had a younger sister and a younger brother who were always told they had the same father, but in reality, her younger sister, I believe, was from a different father, but they were not told that for many, many years. And this is because Simon left Nellie when Dorothy was 4 years old. Now, I've read that he went back to Holland. I really don't know. I do know that once he was gone, there was sort of a constant succession of men, mostly shitty men, courting Nellie, sometimes living with the family, but ultimately always leaving. Now, Nellie had grown up in Holland, like I said, and she grew up there during the First World War and had been taken by authorities from her mother during that time. What I heard was her mother had gone out to work and left the children alone, and they were taken at that time because her mother was seen as unfit. It's very difficult to get specifics from, a different country that far back for somebody who's not necessarily themselves famous, but that is what I read. Her father, Nellie's father, so this is Dorothy's grandfather, died in the war. The family struggled to survive, and eventually, the authorities stepped in. But this was definitely not for the better of the children. Nellie was separated from her brother, who was put in a mental institution, supposedly due to lack of space at the orphanage. And while she was in the orphanage, Nellie had to fight for food, clothing, everything. So, this, coupled with the constant falling of bombs during the war, left her with severe PTSD, along with, as you can imagine, a host of other issues related to being abandoned by her family. When Nellie was pretty young, she married Simon, who I'm sure, was awesome before he abandoned the family when Dorothy was 4 years old. I'm sure everything was just perfect up to that point. Um, that's heavy sarcasm if it's not clear. Anybody who doesn't know me, you're gonna get to know me. From there, the aforementioned men came and went. One relationship produced Louise, the other daughter, who was 8 years younger than Dorothy. So Dorothy is the oldest, often saw, the worst of these relationships, including one where one of Nellie's boyfriend drank the bottle of perfume that Dorothy had given her mother for her birthday. He was such a raging alcoholic, this is so fucked up, that he drank the perfume to get drunk, which is horrible on just so many levels. I don't know that there was ever any physical abuse, but the tone is being set, for bad relationships with men for Dorothy. Like, this is normal for her. This is all she knows. Her mother has modeled this. And I don't necessarily blame her mother because her mother came from, a lot of trauma. So it just feels like these women didn't kind of stand a chance. One reason for all the boyfriends, though, beyond, just the volatility of the household, was that Nellie was very beautiful and Dorothy was very beautiful as well. Um, I usually will not comment on things like that if I can avoid it, but it actually is very important to this story, Dorothy's looks, because she goes to Hollywood. And I think it's, fair to point that out. So when Dorothy was 17, she was working at a Dairy Queen in Vancouver, sort of just living her life. I don't know that she really knew what she wanted to do, but again, she's 17, and she got a lot of attention there. One person in particular who gave her a lot of attention was a man named Paul Snyder. When Dorothy turned 18, barely, I should say, he was 26 and had already established himself in the area as a pimp and a hustler. He promoted nightclubs, which gave him access to a lot of seedy places and people. And, he wasn't good looking, but he was very charming and very good at controlling women to get what he wanted from them, which, as we've talked about, Dorothy's the perfect target. And Paul was the perfect fit for her, considering kind of what she was used to, her idea of what relationships with men should look like. Paul began to lavish her with gifts and compliment her on the things he knew she was insecure about. Because I think, people often don't really realize that really beautiful women tend to be very insecure about their looks. Because I think, on the one hand, they're reduced to the way they look by strangers and friends alike, which is really horrible when you think about it. But also, beauty is fleeting. So it's got to be pretty crazy to think that, the only thing that people value for isn't going to stick around forever. So, anyway, we have Dorothy here, barely 18, naive and wounded, and Paul, older. He's got experience manipulating women. Obviously, he makes money doing this. And Paul had some connections to Hollywood. I'm not 100% sure how, but like, I know he went to LA for a while when he was in trouble in Canada with some bad people over some money. But in any case, he started working on Dorothy, getting her to consider posing nude for him for some test shots to try to get into Playboy. Now, she really wasn't into it at first, and it definitely took some convincing, but of course, she did finally relent, and Paul took these photos and sent them to the editor of Playboy. The editor at the time was a woman named Marilyn Grabowski, and she said that when she saw the photos, she, quote, wanted her on the next plane out to Los Angeles. Again, Dorothy is very naive. She'd never even been on a plane before in her life. But here she goes out to Hollywood with Paul, to meet with Marilyn to get more test photos done. And at that point, Marilyn knows what she's looking at. And she just starts, introducing Dorothy to a ton of people. And pretty soon, before you know it, Dorothy's on her way out to LA to become a star. And I realize that Playboy bunnies really don't very often become stars. Like, I know there was the point where Playboy had the reality series, and we all know some of those, Playboy bunnies from there. But generally, you know, uh, people who pose nude are kind of frowned upon in Hollywood. And I don't know what she thought when she went or what she expected, but I think that Paul sort of, you know, convinced her, no, this is your way in. This is going to make you a star. You're going to be different. You can pose nude and then still get into Hollywood. And I think really, he was just using her. Even if it was short term, he just wanted the money. And I know, part of this was, he was already proposing marriage to her, trying to lock her down. He saw her as his meal ticket, and he was not about to let that go. So he, of course, moved out to LA with her and became something of her manager. He inserted himself into all of her business dealings and used her to propel himself into these groups of people that he could have never, had anything to do with if he didn't have Dorothy. If he wasn't hanging on to her, nobody would have given this loser the time of day. So anyway, Dorothy, starts posing for Playboy and it's very successful. Pretty soon, she's at all the best parties, meeting celebrities from mainstream films, meeting directors. And that same year in 1978, she was officially picked for the 25th anniversary Great Playmate Hunt. Now, this was a huge deal as it propelled her, into the I don't know, the mailboxes of people around the country. I don't know if there was a subscription to Playboy at that point, if it, was just something that men hid under their mattresses. But, around this time, there was a little bit of a shift in Hollywood, and they were a little bit more open to sort of nudity and sex and kind of accepting, people a little bit more into the mainstream. And so Dorothy was really benefiting from this and started to actually be taken seriously, for roles in mainstream movies. And of course, Paul Snyder was with her the entire way. People on set at Playboy said Dorothy seemed lost and scared and would call him multiple times a day to check in and tell him how things were going. He seemed to be sort of her safe person, but most people outside of their relationship saw trouble and saw through his facade of a loving boyfriend and manager. I think it's pretty obvious, he was exploiting Dorothy, and most people saw this. And unfortunately, she was one of the only people who, at least at the time, did not. And he continued to convince her to pose nude for Playboy, even though she said she really didn't want to. He told her again, this is how you get into Hollywood. This is what you're gonna do to like make it. And again, she believed him. And again, they both got lucky. He got lucky lying to her, and it happened to come true. And she got lucky believing him because again, up until this point, most women who posed nude, and I mean, even to this day, there's not a lot of crossover. Oftentimes, the women will start in movies and then like do a Playboy shoot, but it's usually not the other way around. Now, definitely, we've got like Pamela Anderson. There's definitely some women where that's not the case, but in this instance, it was definitely weird. It was not common for somebody to go from Playboy to mainstream. So, in any case, she believed him. She kept working for Playboy, and Hugh Hefner took a lot of interest in Dorothy and kind of took her under his wing. And as we will later learn, very likely abused her while she was under his employment. After Dorothy's death, in fact, it was said that Hugh Hefner had at one point raped her in a hot tub. Now, he vehemently denied this, stating there was no force and that she consented. But this was back before people considered pressuring someone into sex as a part of rape culture. So it's definitely a gray area. This accusation was made by somebody that Dorothy was in a relationship with, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later, which leads me to believe it because it feels like she was probably confiding in this person, something that she felt she couldn't tell people. Because again, he's her boss. He's her way of getting into this industry. He can make her do his bidding. So I do tend to believe that this is true. Maybe not in the purest sense of the word rape, but I do believe that he sexually assaulted her and that it was not consensual. And we've all heard stories, recent stories about, this type of thing. So moving on, we're now in 1979. Dorothy's 19, and she just has all these various men exploiting her for money. And she's also meeting these Hollywood stars, these producers. And, again, they sort of tanked. Hollywood tanked in the 70s. There was like sort of an about face regarding the nude models, like I said. So she did start getting cast in roles for Hollywood films. And the more she was cast and brought into this world, the further she got away from Paul. Paul was not the type of person to transition into a mainstream lifestyle. And Paul was acutely aware of this and was very unhappy to see his meal ticket leave him behind. Before she even became a model, he told his friend that quote, that girl can make me a lot of money. So again, total piece of shit, knows exactly what he's doing. He continues to pressure her about getting married, not because he loves her, but so he can lock her down. And finally, on June 1st, 1979, they were married. When her friends asked her why she married Paul, she said she felt she owed it to him, which is kind of exactly what you might expect given her upbringing and track record, as well as the fact that she's 19. And most 19-year-olds don't make amazing decisions anyway. She's got all these men in her head. She's being exploited at every turn. It's not a good situation. And of course, the marriage did not fix the issues Paul was worried about, as you can imagine. And as Dorothy's fame continued to increase, their time together became less and less. They did live in an apartment together, at least 3 bedrooms, but Dorothy ended up spending more and more time away from home while filming movies in various locations. Although her first few movies weren't large roles or very well received, she was able to make some really great connections via the Playboy Mansion, which had always attracted celebrities even when it was still a very taboo place. The celebrity she met that changed the entire trajectory of her very short life was director Peter Bogdanovich. At the time they met, he had recently split with his celebrity girlfriend, Sybil Shepherd. Now, for those who don't know, Sybil Shepherd was a model turned actress who got her start when Bogdanovich saw her on the cover of Cosmo when she was only 21 or 20 years old. He was 31 at the time and married with 2 children. He, of course, left his wife for Sybil after they, quote, fell in love on the set of The Last Picture Show, probably the best movie he ever made and one of the best movies of all time. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. It's fantastic. In fact, before they fell in love, he told his wife when he saw Sybil on the cover of the magazine that she was the one he was going to cast, saying, quote, that's JC. JC is one of the characters in the movie. The two were together for about 9 years until 1979, when Sybil decided she wanted a family and Peter kind of already had one. From there, Peter was a swinging dick, making critically acclaimed movies, and also ones that were totally fucking panned. As far as his time at Playboy, that actually started in a really weird way that also involved Sybil. Playboy had published photos of Sybil Shepherd nude, which were from The Last Picture Show. They did this without permission, which is super fucked up. And Sybil sued, which is great. She won, and she ended up with some money and also the rights to a film, which Playboy agreed to produce with Bogdanovich directing. So he and Hugh Hefner became kind of frenemies almost, like they were working together and, Hef was funding this movie, Sybil was in it. So as Sybil's partner, obviously he didn't like Hugh, but they did work together and when he became single, he definitely, used his connection to spend a lot of time at the mansion, which is where he met Dorothy. At this point, I want to point out, he was 41. I hit my microphone. I'm mad about this. He was 41. And once again, she's barely 20 years old. I think she may have even still been 19. So he's like, what's his face from Dazed and Confused? Like high school girls, I keep getting older, they stay the same age. It's fucking disgusting. Like total fucking scumbag behavior. To just keep finding like the young blonde. The older he gets, he keeps finding the young blonde. And I want to come back to this because it comes up later, but I am not a fan of this man. I think he's gross. Also, par for the course, for Dorothy to have yet another man, much older than she, sort of controlling her and her career, and just kind of being it's like a father figure. I mean, I think we all kind of know where this is coming from. This is a father figure. So he cast her in a movie, they all laughed, and in a turn of events that shocks absolutely no one, the two, quote, fell in love on set. The film was shot in New York, so it was easy to spend time together without Paul Snyder knowing. They also used the set as a place to rendezvous, of course. And Dorothy would make excuses to not have Paul fly out to be with her, which I'm sure he read between the lines on. At this point, Dorothy was fully over the relationship with Paul. I don't think she was ever truly into it, but, you know, she she'd found her way out. And so she was not only over him, but she was over Playboy. Even so, she was chosen as the Playmate of the Year in early 1980 and did agree to do some publicity for them. She later said that her hatred for Playboy and the photographers actually helped her get through the shoots. I think, she always hated it. And when she was doing the shoots before she had met Peter and before she had sort of made this switch, she felt abused. She felt like a victim. She was being victimized in a way because she had all these men telling her she had to do this, telling her this was what was best for her career. And I think she felt really powerless. And now she has an out with Peter. She has this mainstream Hollywood lifestyle. So she doesn't feel despair at her situation. And instead, this turns into like a rage. She wants to tell them to fuck off. Like, you're not going to use me anymore. I'm going to do this as like a final fuck you. And then I'm fucking done. At one point, she even thought of suing the magazine for printing a photo of her that she didn't realize was being taken and that showed more of her body than she was comfortable with. And I think we can read between the lines on that. As we know, because of Sybil Shepherd here, Playboy had no problem printing unauthorized photos of naked women. Anyway, by early 1980, she was starting to really pull away from Paul, done with Playboy, and Paul, in his jealousy, used her money because they had a shared bank account because they were married and he wasn't working to hire a private detective to follow her and get information about her and to see if she was having an affair. I'm sure this PI was able to confirm the affair long before Dorothy told Paul, but eventually the truth did come out and she asked him to separate and divorce. Upon coming back to Los Angeles from filming the movie, she immediately moved into Peter Bogdanovich's Brentwood home, and the two planned to marry as soon as her divorce was final. Now, Paul lost his entire fucking mind. He was still using her money to pay the PI, but realized that was about to dry up. So, as soon as Dorothy told him she wanted a divorce, he drained something like $15,000 from their shared account before she cut off access to it. Dorothy was still making money, and as far as I know, started putting it into a different account. So his funds definitely had a limit since he was not working. And then she and Peter, just tried to move on. Now, they were obviously, or seemingly, I should say, very happy. He's 21 years her senior. So again, that's a bit of a problem to me. But Paul kept begging Dorothy to see him, to talk, to try to work things out. At one point, during all of this, he also, quote, borrowed a gun from a friend. He had apparently made a comment about killing Dorothy. And at one of the times they met up, he lost his nerve. He told his friend that he instead had driven out to a park and considered suicide, but also lost his nerve there as well. As the months wore on, though, he became much more desperate, to the point that he asked the PI if they would buy him a gun. Thank God the PI was like, abso-fucking-lutely not. So instead, he bought one from a private seller he found in the paper because it's definitely not difficult to get a gun, especially back then, even in California. What he bought was a 12 gauge shotgun, which, just thinking about like what that kind of weapon does to a person is insane. He then convinced Dorothy to meet with him. She agreed, expecting that they would discuss splitting up their money and property. She was going to give him a little money to help him out until he could get on his feet. She was trying to be kind, and she wanted to amicably settle their divorce. And again, she's 20 years old. She's, doesn't have a lot of experience with this. Not the best idea, but she did agree to meet with him. So she met him at their formerly shared apartment, which he then had two roommates living with him, but neither of those roommates were home. Now this was on August 14th, 1980. When his roommates came home later, they said they found his door closed and saw Dorothy's car outside, and they had kind of assumed that the two had reconciled, so they left them alone. This was because, there was a lot of back and forth in their relationship, much like what Dorothy was used to in her home life growing up. And I think the roommates were sort of used to this kind of thing going on. The next day, however, they had still seen neither Paul nor Dorothy, so they decided to knock on Paul's door. When he did not answer, they opened it and went into his room. And very unfortunately, they found an absolutely horrifying scene. Both Paul and Dorothy were naked inside the room, and both were dead. Dorothy was on the bed and had been shot in the face with the shotgun. She was also missing a piece of her finger as she had put her hand up in self defense as Paul shot her. There was also some sort of horrific sex machine in the room that Paul had made, and it was later determined, and this is big trigger warning, that it was used to sodomize Dorothy while she was still alive. There was also evidence that he raped her, either pre or post mortem. I've read both. But in either case, he was clearly using this as a way to assert his power over her and to show her one final time that he was in charge. He also, I think used killing her and then himself as a way of showing everyone that in the end they couldn't mess with him without paying the price. This is a man who saw his meal ticket getting away, who was bitter at the world because he was not allowed into these groups. The woman he wanted didn't love him. He's just a piece of shit, obviously. But this is sort of his final fuck you. So Paul was also shot in the head, not in the face, but shot in the head. He was 29. Dorothy was only 20. This was huge news, extraordinarily sad, just fucking terrible. She had become kind of a darling, in Hollywood. People knew who she was. People loved her. She was beautiful. She was funny. She was, a good actress. People were just very, very upset about this. And from here, the so called men in her life used her death in various ways to write books, to make movies, more exploitation of this poor woman, even in her death. Both Hugh Hefner and Peter Bogdanovich went after each other's character, which is hilarious. And I wanted to take a little time to discuss those specifics because of what I said about, Bogdanovich earlier on. So Peter was the one to claim that Hugh Hefner raped Dorothy. And again, I do believe that. And I think we all kind of know Hugh Hefner's track record in general. He was not a great person. When you build your empire on the bodies of naked women, you're probably not a good guy. And beyond this, Bogdanovich blamed Hugh Hefner, saying that it was the Playboy culture that led to her death, saying, her being in that world with that guy Paul and with people exploiting her was exactly why this happened. In return, Hef came out denying everything, denying the rape, saying it's not okay to blame Playboy, basically saying, Playboy's been blamed every time something goes sideways with anybody connected to us. And I honestly do see both sides of this sort of, but I think especially back then, most women who were involved in this type of lifestyle were not they didn't have the best lives in general. It was definitely big exploitation. Now, we can talk sex positive and say that there's opportunities now where women are in control, but I do believe back then it was a very different landscape where this type of thing was concerned. So, Hef comes out, denies all of this. He also calls Peter Bogdanovich out for rape, but not rape of Dorothy, statutory rape of Dorothy's younger sister. Now, let's remember that when Dorothy died, I mentioned her sister was 8 years younger than her. So Dorothy was 20, Louise was 12. Hugh Hefner said that Peter Bogdanovich began grooming her immediately after Dorothy's death in some twisted grief power thing where he just can't let Dorothy go. So he's doing the next best thing and grooming her sister. And let's not pretend that he doesn't like his women very, very young. So it's not that big of a leap to think that he would do something like this, especially when he's grieving and used to, he's a producer, he's or a director in Hollywood. He's like big guy, he's probably used to getting his way. This is not out of the realm of possibility. And what comes next is going to kind of drive this home. So Dorothy's family launched a lawsuit against Hugh Hefner saying, this is defamation and da 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 da. They then dropped it pretty promptly. A few years later, when Louise Stratten was 20 years old, the magic number, she and then 49-year-old Peter Bogdanovich were married. I wonder why they dropped the lawsuit. Fucking disgusting shit all around. And I wanted to take a moment also to say that Luisa's former father in law came out in an interview, and I can't verify this story, but he did come out in an interview and say that Peter not only groomed Louise, he was also grooming Nellie, Dorothy's mother. And he and Nellie are not married anymore. And according to him, Peter Bogdanovich is a big reason why. So this just sounds disgusting all around. All of the men in this story are complicit in the exploitation, the abuse, and ultimately the death of Dorothy Stratten. All of these men are fucking disgusting. I cannot fucking believe this. The fact that her younger sister, who does look a lot like her, was 8 years younger than her and, you know, marries Peter, like what the fuck? And people love him. They love him as a director. And what's interesting is I hear other podcasts covering this case, and they all tell the love story of Dorothy and Peter. And I am like, fucking gag me. This is not a love story. This is just another in a long line of abusive men that this poor young woman dealt with before she was finally murdered by one of them. And it is a tale as old as time. There is nothing. I could never feel sorry for Peter Bogdanovich in this situation. I could never feel bad for him because he's a part of the fucking problem. And he can sit here and point fingers at Playboy. But dude, without Playboy exploiting her, they wouldn't have had her ready for you to come in and exploit either. So give me a fucking break. I'm sorry. I hate it. I hate it so much. It's so gross. So, this story is really sad and horrific and really centered, around these three horrible abusive men drunk on power and the way they all just harmed Dorothy, who was just lost in the world and trying to make a life for herself. Now, there have been numerous songs, movies, and books written about the very short and tragic life of Dorothy Stratten, including one by Peter. That's where these accusations were launched because, of course, he has to write a book about it and make some money off of the tragedy. Um, it's just a really fucked up situation. And I think he and Louise were married for actually like a decent amount of time. They had some kids together. None of it makes it okay. None of it makes it okay. And there's no way that that accusation of statutory rape was just happened to be correct. There's no way you get that lucky. Like that shit was going on. Everybody fucking knew it. So, I mean, I hate that this is her legacy, that it's just mired in all of this disgusting, gross business, but that's Hollywood. So that's it. That's the story of Dorothy Stratten, her very sad, short life. I feel terrible for her. She was beautiful. She seemed extraordinarily sweet, talented, and she had the potential to have such a long, successful, beautiful life, and it was just cut short. And that really fucking sucks. So, all right, guys, there we have it. There's episode one. Some of these will definitely be longer than others. They're going to be slightly deeper dives than we did on the Twisted Listers podcast for the most part. But I did just want to get kind of a well known case out there to get the party started, as it were. Thanks again for listening. I hope you guys continue to tune in. Thanks for supporting. I know the commercials are annoying, but if you can listen, it puts a little money in my pocket and makes it worthwhile for me. I'll be back again next week with another California story of true crime, some sort of murder. We're going to do some survivor stories as well. And until then, thanks everybody.